All the learning this week in the Yeshiva is in memory of David Baltu's mother. And the topic today is going to be one of the last ones in the principles of the Melachot. Then we'll go directly into the Melachot. As an introduction, I'll just say that the Tractate of Shabbat has 24 chapters, and I was told a long time ago that that's one chapter for every hour of Shabbat. Rabbi Melamed doesn't follow that suggestion, and I think there's 30 some chapters in Peninei Halacha. But we're getting there because we're finishing chapter 8, so good stuff. So the question that we talked before about grama and kiyum and all the other leniencies, we're going back a little bit to the biblical. The biblical very clearly says, and it says it in both places of the Ten Commandments, but the Ten Commandments in Shmot talk more about coming out of Egypt and that the reason for Shabbat is the creation, while in Deuteronomy, in Parashat Vayetchanan, there's more words that are added for the reason for Shabbat. Torah doesn't usually give the reason, but when it says leman, that is understood by our rabbis as a reason. So the verse says, "V'yom hashvi'i Shabbat l'Adonai Elohecha, lo ta'asechu melacha." So you shall not do any creative labor, which we already discussed. However, we are adding ata uvincha uvitecha, you, your son and your daughter, v'avdecha v'amatecha, your slave and your maidservant, non-Jewish, as we'll see, v'shorcha v'chamorcha, your ox and your donkey, v'chol be'emtecha, that's a klal, all of your animals, and there's a discussion if that's only domesticated animals or not. Ve'gercha asher b'sharecha, obviously anybody who converted, even if they are only through half the process. So for a male, it will be what's called mal ve'lo taval. He did the circumcision, but still hasn't dunked. And the reason for Shabbat, according to this, is leman yanuach avdecha v'matcha kamocha, so that your slaves and maidservants can rest as you do on Shabbat. So Rabbi Melamed explains that even though the parsha this week starts with the idea of a slave, this week we're talking about a Hebrew slave, but a non-Jewish slave is at the end of Leviticus, of Vayikra, and there it's very clear that they had a quasi status as a Jew, but like women that aren't obligated to do positive commandments that are time bound. So, in addition to the prohibition of doing melacha on Shabbat, we are also enjoined to allow our entire household to rest, children, servants, and animals. It's not in order of priority or importance. It's just that's exactly how it is written in the Torah. As it is written, you shall not do any melacha, you, your son, your daughter, your male or female slave, your ox or your donkey, or any of your cattle, or the stranger in your settlements, so that your male and female slave may rest as you do. So thus we see that in addition to the rabbinic obligation in general to educate our children toward mitzvah observance, what's called chinuch mitzvot, there's also a Torah obligation to make sure that no melacha is done on Shabbat by a child. Similarly, the Torah prohibits allowing one's non-Jewish servant to do melacha. In order to understand the significance of this, we must first explain that according to the Torah, a non-Jewish servant who is acquired by a Jew, must undergo conversion, after which he must keep all the mitzvot except for time-bound positive ones. Should his master decide to free him, he becomes a normal Jew, obligated in all of the commandments, including time-bound positive ones. And there's a fascinating story that Rabbi Gladstein gave a few classes about, where Rabbi Gamliel, in different places in the Mishnah, it says that he treated his slave Tavi as an almost Jew. The first thing that is mentioned is that he released him in order for him to be counted for a minion. So I'll just describe the scenario the way I see it. It's almost sunset, and man number 10 is not showing up, and Rabbi Gamliel had Tavi with him, so he wrote immediately what's called shtar shichrur. It's much simpler than a get. It just says, you are now free to be yourself, and since he was already converted like a quasi-Jew, the way that I just described it, he was now counted for the minyan. That's not a biblical mitzvah, so it's even more surprising. But the other two times that I remember that he did was that he sat shiva when Tavi died, and he accepted condolences. So he completely treated him as a Jew, and there's a little bit of discrepancy because obviously, if you released him for a minyan, he would have died as a full-blown Jew. So why was there even a question about sitting shiva for him? I don't know. But he wasn't related to him, so maybe that's the answer. So therefore, even while he is a servant, since he has undergone conversion, he is obligated by Torah law to keep Shabbat. The Torah further requires the master to supervise their servant and make sure that he does not work on Shabbat. If a servant has not undergone conversion, so either you bought them on Friday or for other reason, he is not obligated to keep Shabbat, but he may do melacha only for his own benefit, but not for the Jewish person's behalf. The Torah decrees that just as the Jew must rest, he must also not request that his servant perform melacha for him on Shabbat, as the Torah states that the son of your servant and the stranger may be refreshed. That's in this week's parsha. The sages explain that this refers to a servant who has not undergone conversion, because that would make sense why there's another law regarding it. The sages also forbade a Jew to ask a non-Jew to do melacha for him on Shabbat, with occasional exceptions in cases of rabbinic prohibitions or of great necessity for mitzvah. So the most common example today is that the lights are off and you want to daven, or it's really, really hot and the air conditioner stopped working. You're allowed to, just giving a little bit of preview, that you're allowed to say to them in a hint, it's really hot in here, or it's really dark in here, and then they can do it. But again, it's only in the case of a rabbinic prohibition, not actually cooking or lighting a fire or anything like that. Torah also prohibits having malacha done by one's animals. However, one's inanimate possessions do not need to rest on Shabbat. Therefore, a Jew may lend items to a non-Jew for doing malacha on Shabbat, as long as it will not appear as if the non-Jew is acting on the Jew's behalf. We talked about that in basic, about the bathhouse that is owned by two partners or a silent partner, and we'll get to it more in later on. But I just wanted to make two observations about this. If you remember when we had the kollel, when Rabbi was still Noev Shalom, one of the halachas that we were discussing was netilat yadayim, that washing our hands before the meal or waking up in the morning, and that it can be done by a monkey or an elephant. And so again, that if washing our hands would have been a melacha, then it would not be allowed in Shabbat. But of course, it isn't. So that's why I think it's talking about the domesticated animals, that we're not allowed to plow with them, and we're not allowed to do any kind of work that we would usually do with these animals. And the other thing is Rabbi Chanina ben Dosa, who was one of our most holy sages, if we had such a thing as saints, he his if I remember correctly, it was his donkey. His donkey was stolen, and the people were required to return it because the donkey would not eat food that wasn't tithed, and they tried to work on making the donkey work on Shabbat, and so that's how well trained our animals should be. That they, even if they're not in our possession temporarily, that they should not work on Shabbat. And we'll stop here and open it for questions.